by tweeting us using the hashtag ThreatWatch. But first, I would like to set the scene and introduce our speakers. Okay, since the dawn of the Internet in the federal government, a short string of characters is all that stood between agency data and an increasingly hostile outside world. In the wake of continued high-profile hacks and leaks, which have been made possible partly by our password-dependent security, the government is starting to explore alternatives like two-factor authentication as a way to better protect its infrastructure. Our two guests will explore what efforts are underway to beef up identity management, as it's called, efforts in government and in industry, and whether the password will ever truly go away. So next to me here, I have Eric Avakian. He is the Chief Information Security Officer for the whole state of Pennsylvania. Before that, he was the Deputy CISO, and he has been serving the Commonwealth for close to a decade now. Next to him, we have Jeremy Grant from the federal government, and he serves as the Senior Executive Advisor for Identity Management at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of the Commerce Department. And there he heads up an effort to, perhaps you wouldn't say kill the password, but augment it, delete it in some cases, and make sure that our identities are more secure when we're transacting online. And that effort is called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, better known as INSTIC. And years ago, he helped mold legislation that gave rise to the Defense Department's biometric ID card, the CAT card, which some in our audience may be familiar with, and that kind of relates to the whole INSTIC strategy. So the first question I'll throw out to both our guests is, what has the government accomplished so far in getting rid of the password? And Jeremy, if you'll start.
Sure, thanks, and hi Internet, and thanks to NextGov for having us here today. So I think before I answer that question, what's the government doing to make progress in, and I think it's okay to say shooting the password. In fact, when it comes to passwords and strong authentication, it's safe to say the Obama administration supports the right of all Americans to carry multi-factor authentication. But there's a reason for that. It's that passwords are a real problem when it comes to Internet security. There's a great study that Verizon does each year in partnership with a bunch of law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, called the Data Breach Investigations Report. Its 2013 report found that a whopping 76% of all network intrusions and breaches were actually executed by taking advantages of different weaknesses of passwords that are out there. 76% is a pretty whopping number. It means it's basically an anomaly today when you hear about a big breach in the news and it's not being executed by taking advantage of one of the weaknesses of a password. And we've certainly seen, the headlines of the last couple of years play that out. Passwords are really weak for a variety of reasons. For starters, they're getting more and more complex, and we're being asked to manage more and more of them. It's really the worst combination of usability and security that anybody could imagine. If you're being told to manage 27 or 30 different unique usernames or passwords, have every one of them be 12 characters with uppercase, lowercase, symbols, and numbers, don't make any two of them the same, don't write them down, that is a recipe for, I don't think there's anybody who does that. I certainly don't do that, despite the fact that that's what we're guided to do, because it's simply impossible. And so you see people reusing passwords across sites, which means if a password is compromised at one site, it might be reused at another. You still have most of the population simply using really weak passwords, things like 1234556 or password 1 or princess. It's really easy to compromise them. In terms of what the government's done, both to undermine this point, underscore this point, as well as make progress, it's definitely worth talking about the Common Access Card, which Aaliyah mentioned in a previous life. I played a small role in helping get off the ground back when I was a Senate aide in the late 1990s. The Department of Defense found when they migrated all of their login systems from username and password to mandating the Common Access Card, which is a very secure smart card with strong encryption and several digital certificates, when you could only log in with that card, their network intrusions fell 46% overnight. This was back in 2005. Which is really a pretty stunning number. This was what happened when all of the stolen and spoofed usernames and passwords suddenly became useless. And in the government today, we've made pretty good progress in some of the civilian agencies as well with the PIV card, which is the, I would say, the sister or the brother of the Common Access Card for civilian agencies. But when it comes to both our citizen-facing applications as well as what people are using in their own personal lives, everything's still pretty password dominant today, and we need to make some changes there. A big step forward, in addition to President Obama issuing the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace 3.5 years ago, came just about 3 weeks ago when the President signed an executive order on October 17th that mandates that within 18 months, all citizen-facing applications that are releasing personal data to citizens mandate the use of multi-factor authentication that's bound to an effective identity proofing process, essentially saying if there's personal data at stake, a password's not going to cut it anymore. Everybody in the government's going to have to raise their game to make sure these applications are secure and make sure that we can inspire confidence among citizens that data is really going to be protected at every step of the way.
So I think Jeremy puts out some really important points when it comes to what is the issue and what are the problems with the password. I think many years ago, where this might have been a good idea or it seemed like a secure idea, it's come to the point where something's got to change. I mean, folks that have 30 or 40 different passwords, it's not sustainable. It's not something that people can memorize. And so the bad guys know this. So the bad guys are going out there and they're social engineering, they're phishing folks for their credentials because they know that if they can get their credentials to whatever that they're doing, they could probably get their credentials to their work account or something more secure like their banking account. So this has become a real big problem, and users have been taught, again, to have different passwords, but it's really unsustainable because users these days are doing so much business online with a multitude of accounts, whether it's their banking transactions, work, you go down the list, webmail, and all the other different types of transactions they do. It's just not sustainable. So I think that the government's on the right path, and what we've done in Pennsylvania, while we're obviously not there, we're taking steps to get to that end point. And so some of the things that we've been doing is getting rid of the silos, really so putting, from a directory standpoint, really consolidating all those different siloed directories that are out there into one consolidated directory. And then in line with the executive order is putting in multi-factor authentication controls so that at least we're in a good place to when we eventually pass that threshold of getting rid of the passwords, when we can get to that point, we're in a good place to do it when and if the time that comes. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Now we're going to branch out again to the federal government. And Jeremy, if you could talk about a brand new project which is expected to launch for the citizens and agency employees by the end of the year, something called connect.gov?
Sure. No, happy to talk about it. So, to give a little bit of background on the broader program I run, that this sort of leads to where we're going with Connect, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, NSTIC as it's known. It's a strategy that was an initiative launched by the White House 3.5 years ago that calls for the creation of an identity ecosystem, essentially a marketplace where everybody in the country can choose within a couple years from a variety of different types of credentials that they can use every place they go online in lieu of passwords for experiences that are more secure, more privacy-enhancing, and more convenient than what they do today. A big part of the strategy is calling for federal agencies to actually be early adopters of this identity ecosystem, leveraging different commercially issued credentials that you might already have in your pocket today to actually be able to access government sites. So in simple terms, that means that if I'm signing into, let's say I'm a veteran signing into the My Healthy Vet portal at the Department of Veterans Affairs, I may go through a process where the VA issues me a credential, or I may go through a process where instead I might already have a credential that the government has certified as meeting their needs from, say, a commercial firm that's already accredited, such as, to name some of the ones that are at this level of assurance, Verizon or Symantec or ID.me. In that case, why should the government have to issue me a credential? I've already got something that I can use. Connect.gov is really the next step to advance all this. What we've seen is while we've had a certification process for some of these firms to get their credentials certified, getting agencies to actually have an easy button to integrate with all of them has been really hard. And so based on a White House Tiger team that was launched a couple of years ago, where a number of big agencies with major citizen-facing applications came together, they all identified a need for a government-wide shared service that would basically help all agencies integrate with all of these different credentialing solutions. In simple terms, what this means for agencies is that any agency that wants to integrate with all of these accredited solutions from commercial firms, or other, it doesn't have to be commercial, it could be a nonprofit as well, only connects once to this portal, Connect.gov, and Connect.gov does the hard work of connecting to the rest of these credentials. And for a citizen, what it means is if you have a credential in your pocket that the government's willing to accept, that credential can be used to log in at every site across the government. You don't have to go through a process of creating a new login account each time. So it's much better for the citizen, gives them more security, more convenience in a way that protects their privacy and reduces the hassle of having to create new accounts. We think this will help reduce friction in online services and enable government to really interact with citizens in a bunch of new, more personalized ways than they are able to do today.
So for certain transactions with the government that require a high level of security, you know, financial ones, maybe you'll use your Experian ID that you've used to get your credit report. Maybe some, you know, if you want to create an account on USA Jobs to track certain employment opportunities, you may be allowed to use your Google ID.
Yeah, the idea is choice, and of course, you know, right now we have a process today where, you know, from an OMB memo back in 2003, memo 0404, prescribes 4 levels of assurance ranging from low to high that's commensurate with the risk involved in an application. So if I'm just logging into data.gov and the only reason that they want to give me a login is to know, say, what the 3 or 4 data sets are that I search for every 2 weeks when I come in, if that account's compromised, it doesn't really matter. So they're logging in with, you know, a Google or a Yahoo or a PayPal. Really a simple password replacement is fine. On the other hand, if I'm then going over to, I'll use the VA portal in part because they're participating in the Connect.gov pilot, I want to make sure if I'm getting something, like my personal health record through touching the blue button, that's got to be a pretty darn good credential that I'm using to actually get into that. And so there the bar is higher. It's going to be a smaller number of credentials you can use. And by the way, it'll actually work with the PIV and the Common Access Card as well for federal employees who might be going to an application that they're doing not in their work capacity, but in their personal capacity.
Okay. So InStick. You've been working, both of you have been working on this for a few years, and there are pilot programs which are funded by federal grants every year, and Eric's the beneficiary of one of those. But at the same time, you have companies like Apple who are coming up with the Apple Pay credential, moving ahead with or without InStick. And an advisor to NIST at Microsoft asked, does the InStick strategy, does that vision have to be accelerated so that the privacy and security policies are in place to you know, really realize the vision, or is industry just going to go and do its own thing?
So it's a tricky question. Let me, you know, start by saying NSTIC's a strategy. It's I'm an old poli-sci major from back in the day. So back in college in Ann Arbor, I learned about legislation, learned about regulation, I learned about executive orders. I never learned about strategies because they're not typically something that government actually does where they have any real authority. And you know, the way I describe NSTIC more than anything else is it's an aspirational document. It paints a vision of what we want the marketplace to look like. But we were really clear in the strategy. The White House was really clear. They want it to be led by the private sector. And our role in government is simply to do everything we can to facilitate and catalyze the private sector to lead. So I will say there are some companies who are, you know, blatantly involved, if that's the right word, in the implementation of NSTIC, either because they're participating in one of our pilots or they've joined the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, which is a private 501c3 not-for-profit organization that was founded to help catalyze really a foundation of standards and policies that could help govern this identity ecosystem. And there's also a lot of other companies who aren't so obviously involved, but we still meet with and talk to, and we talk to about the strategy and why some of the ideas are the right ones for them and to consider in their product roadmaps. And so without talking about any one specific company, sometimes we see things happening in the private sector that are directly reflective of, you know, conversations we've been able to have, and we're able to see the influence of the NSTIC. So in terms of, you know, whether things should be accelerated, look, I'm the guy who runs the program, and, you know, I'm in a hurry. We got a lot of problems we're trying to solve. I'm up for doing anything we can to help make things move faster towards this vision that was actually laid out by the president 3.5 years ago. But it is just a strategy, and I think a lot of the things that we'd like to see, unless we were to have legislation or regulation, there's nothing that's going to compel the private sector. This is all about a voluntary, multi-stakeholder collaborative effort to get organizations in line. But I'll say certainly when we look at the proliferation of multi-factor authentication solutions that are now offered for free through a lot of sites that we do business with every day, when we look at things like the FIDO Alliance and OpenID Connect as new standards that are emerging from the private sector, not directly to support NSTIC, but they do support NSTIC. A lot of them, the designs in these new standards is actually really focused on how do you come up with more secure, privacy-enhancing, easy-to-use identity solutions. We're really excited because we start to see the marketplace responding, again, in some cases, wrapping themselves directly in the flag of this great strategy that was signed 3.5 years ago, and in some cases they don't want to, but that doesn't mean that they're not paying attention.
Right. So since there are no hard and fast security or privacy rules associated with this, the industry is welcome to have conversations with you and get some advice, or they can go ahead and create the marketplace that you're hoping will grow. Eric, going down to the state level. So what is the goal of your NSTIC pilot? What are you testing right now? And how does this fit into what Jeremy was talking about?
Sure. Well, we're really excited to be part of this and to have the opportunity to be awarded this grant to take part in NSTIC. I mean, when we look at the goals of NSTIC and what it's the right thing to do, right? So as a Commonwealth standpoint, if you look at what the issues that have been facing us over the past several years, I mean, people are doing business online. When it comes to, if somebody's going to Amazon, for instance, they have they want to buy this, they want to buy that, they have one shopping cart, and at the bottom they can go out, they can check out at that shopping cart. And I think what you've seen in state government is a struggle when it comes to that single face of government concept. And one of the things to drive more citizens to do transactions online is a single face of government, to get to the point where citizens can go out there, streamline their experience online, make it more pleasurable, so that if they're going out and they want to get their fishing license and their driver's license renewal and do some other type of service, they can do that in that one type of shopping cart. In order to do that, we've really got to get to that single credential, that one single credential to get to that one-stop shop that we're looking to do. So it's really in line with our objectives. We've got a very strong identity and access management program in the Commonwealth, and it's really taking it to the next level. We've already done user provisioning within our employees. Well, really, how do we get to the next step? And so by partnering with our Department of Human Services, really enveloping a directory service working with them as a center of excellence for that unified directory service. So getting rid of all those siloed directories that are out there at the different agencies. And I mentioned earlier, this is one of that first path as you get rid of the password is really consolidating all those different credentials into one centralized directory. And so we've been working with them with that. And so what we're also doing is working with folks like Experian, as Jeremy mentioned, those different assurance levels. So if somebody goes in and they just have a credential for the most basic of transactions, just maybe logging into a website or getting some information, as you move up the level of validation, then we're working with folks like Experian, working with things like dual-factor authentication to really make to ensure that whatever transaction they're doing, that level's there to vet that person is who they say they are. And so it's also from a security standpoint, we're protecting data because we're not passing sensitive data from agency to agency to agency. I think that's one of the misconceptions is that, well, you've got to share sensitive data all over the place. And quite to the contrary, by really limiting it to one user credential, we're calling it the Keystone ID. So a citizen goes in, they can have one credential, it's a Keystone ID, they can use that across a myriad of applications. And once they're vetted from one application, they don't have to continuously re-enroll or validate themselves. So we really look at this as a streamlined process to really give citizens the efficient access they need to applications and to their services. It reduces fraud, it improves service delivery to them, and really improves the security because you're now consolidating all that stuff into one directory. And we're looking at things we've already started working with our Human Relations Commission. So in about 2 weeks, we're going to be rolling out the first one of these applications. It's on our radar. And so what they've been doing is this discriminations claims process, which has all been done by paper. So if you're a citizen and you have a discrimination claim, you've had to go and fill out some paper forms and do some other laborious processes. It's been very inefficient. There's different forms for different types of discrimination claims. And so by implementing an application that's streamlined where they can go in, fill out the form online, and by using Experian for that validation of who that person is, by using that directory service, we now have a system that validates that person, that puts them into that Keystone ID, streamlines the process for what they were doing before, which was all paper-based, taking it to the next level, putting it online, and making it a much more secure, streamlined experience for the end user citizen. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. We want our citizens to be able to have the experience that they do when they go to a site like Amazon. It's quick, it's easy, they can get all the services they need. And this pilot is just, we've really made a lot of progress, and I think there's a lot more progress to come. So we're very excited about it, and it is the right thing to do, and it's going to make better use of the technology, it's going to make our systems more secure, and it's going to better serve the citizens and the taxpayers by reducing costs and eliminating waste.
Now, I have a question following up on that. So you have one Keystone credential. You still have one, it is a password, right?
Correct.
Okay, but so we're getting rid of passwords.
Right, so I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's the first step, right? So we really need to consolidate. You've got so many silos out there today. So if you're going to eliminate passwords, I think for us the first step is to really consolidate. Get rid of the silo directories that are out there. Because with those silo directories, you really have that problem of 30 or 40 different passwords. So by really consolidating that into one directory, at least it begins the process of you're ready for if and when there's that other form of dual multi-factor authentication, you can take that step because you've already done that consolidation. So we look at it as a stepping stone to get to that ultimate nirvana.
Okay. Now, respond to the criticism that's been out there for a while that this is a national online ID, single point of failure, government-issued credential for tracking people online.
Well, it's an easy one to respond to because the government's not doing anything like that. And if you pay close attention to what the actual solutions are that are being promoted in the marketplace through the pilots, through connect.gov, it's a total 180 from the government actually issuing a credential. The national ID discussion is something, we've had this debate in the country a number of times over the last, 100 years or so. And it's pretty clear there's not political support to issue a national ID. And speaking personally, even if there was support, I don't know that it would solve any problems. It tends to be held up a lot of times as a solution to problems, but when you start to dig into how it would actually be used, it's not really clear it actually would solve the problems. In fact, one of the things that the White House did when they were putting together the NSTIC was look at some of the other digital identity strategies being implemented around the world by a lot of other countries who have turned to national IDs, and they found with a few exceptions, a lot of them really aren't actually delivering much return on investment, in part because you're locking people into a single technology at a time when technology is moving rapidly. And there's not necessarily a lot of comfort, even in other countries where they're more comfortable with a national ID, of using that credential in applications that don't interface with government. So everything about NSTIC from the start, there was a recognition the worst thing the government could do would be not only to call for a national ID, but to even call for a certain kind of technology to be issued. So everything here is about how do you catalyze a marketplace where consumers have choice in terms of the kinds of credentials that they use to access services online, both in the private sector and government. And choice is an important part of this in that, part of choice is that it's all voluntary. If you don't want to get a credential and you want to do services the old-fashioned way through, paper or the mail, you can do that as well. But everything here is about enabling choice for the consumer, making it easier for them to have better security, better privacy. And I want to be clear too, there's not a push to even force people towards a single ID. I know Eric was talking in Pennsylvania, they're trying to consolidate. In terms of the national strategy, the whole NSTIC itself, there's nothing trying to push people to take even one credential. I point out I have 5 different email addresses right now that I use for different personas of mine online. One's my just me. A second's what I use to engage in my neighborhood listservs. A third is what I use when I buy stuff because all the stuff that comes in with offers afterwards, I just don't want clogging up my regular inbox. And I've got a couple others as well. There's nothing that would preclude people from getting 4 or 5 different types of strong credentials and using them in different places like keys in a keychain, choosing the appropriate credential that they want for every transaction at that point.
Yeah, and I think from Pennsylvania's standpoint, so we're using our Enterprise Citizen Directory as our identity provider. And so from a privacy standpoint, it's not really any single credential that's going to be shared. It's not something where we're prying into the privacy of folks. And we are looking at the possibility of using other identity providers as well. such as social media, whether it's Facebook. I mean, one of the drawbacks, I guess, of managing a directory is the overhead that comes with that, when it comes to people changing their passwords or resetting passwords. So by partnering or by looking at some of these other technologies, and I agree that by not limiting it to any one technology, by really opening it up to, because technology is changing all the time, that drives down costs. So ultimately, if everybody would say, okay, this is the way we're going to do it, this is how, this is the system we're going to use, that's just going to drive up the cost. So I think by taking and leveraging these other types of technologies from especially the social media providers, leveraging those types of identity providers outside the Commonwealth, that's just going to drive down the cost, and it makes the user experience, they're used to what they know. They're used to doing, they're used to those accounts. So I think that we could take advantage of that. But definitely, we don't look at it as a government-issued ID at all. And the goal is to enhance security and privacy at the same time. So that's the way we look at it.
Yeah. One thing I do want to say, though, on the topic of choice is one thing that we do think belongs in the identity ecosystem is the choice for citizens. If they want to leverage some element of a government-issued credential within the identity ecosystem, they should be able to do so. We've got a pilot right now about to kick off with the state of Virginia and Inova Health Systems, enabling Virginians to log into Inova to download their personal health record. And the way that they're proving that they really are who they claim to be and not the proverbial dog on the internet is leveraging validated attributes that come from the Virginia DMV that were obtained when they went to do their in-person proofing to get their Virginia driver's license. Likewise, we're looking at some other pilots with the Postal Service where, think about it. How do you get a passport today? Well, you go to the post office and they look at a bunch of your documents, and that's how they start the process. I think government has an important role to play, particularly in doing some of the in-person identity proofing. Just because we're doing it today, why should we have to force Americans to go through that whole process again to get a credential if they instead could ask the Postal Service or the DMV to transmit certain validated attributes about them to a credential issuer so that they can then have a stronger, more secure credential?
And that's a great point, too, because we've done that. So in Pennsylvania, working with our Department of Transportation, right, to validate, so for instance, somebody's driver's license number. So utilizing them, utilizing folks like Experian, that's just going to make that validation of who that person is much more secure. And then if there are other opportunities, whether it's a different agency that has different information that can really validate that person. So we're looking to partner as much as we can, but we've started with our Department of Transportation and companies like Experian.
This is the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Cyberspace is bigger than the federal government. It's international. Some credential providers might be based in other countries, and some countries have their own kind of connect.govs going on. Estonia has its own credential, and the UK just launched something similar called Verify. Jeremy, have you been talking with international partners?
Quite a bit, and it's funny you bring up Estonia and the UK because they're two countries we talk quite a bit with, and they really couldn't be any more different in terms of what they're doing. Estonia, I mentioned before, national ID programs not really delivering return on investment. Estonia is probably the opposite of that. There's not a better reference, that we can show in terms of what you can actually do with a really good smart card national ID than what's been done in Estonia. And a lot of times we get asked, why don't you do that here? And the answer is, it worked really well for Estonia, which is a country of about 1.3 million people, and let's just say it's a little different than what we're dealing with here in the U.S. I think it's smaller than Fairfax County. So it's not to put down what they've done. It's actually a really great example of how a national ID card can work. But I think the politics there, I think what the citizens' expectations are in terms of identity solutions and the relationship with government are fundamentally different than what we're dealing with in the U.S. And so while we share lessons learned, particularly because at the end of the day, whether it's the government issuing a credential or a private sector partner, we still want to make sure that other online service providers are willing to accept it and use it. There's a lot of similarities in terms of what we deal with there. There's just not a lot else that really you can compare. The UK, on the other hand, is really similar to NSTIC. In fact, there are some folks involved with their identity assurance program who've joked that for their digital identity strategy, they really just wanted to take this and add some extra U's to words like color and flavor so they were spelled correctly. But we've been working really quite closely with them, in large part because the current politics in the UK around digital identity are actually quite similar to that in the US. Under the previous Labour government, there was a huge effort to launch a national ID card, and it became a really big political issue in the last election to the point that the Conservatives promised that they came in that they would terminate the program. And in fact, they basically dragged the servers that were represented the National Identity Database, because they had started enrolling people in the program, and dragged it out into a public square and blew the whole thing up. It was a little bit like the death of disco at Comiskey in 1979, if you remember that one. So all of this happened. Great, we killed the program, and then somebody said, yes, but we still need a digital identity strategy. And that was when they pivoted quite a bit to looking at what we were doing, working with accredited private sector partners. So Chris Ferguson and David Rennie and Janet Hughes and the gang over in the Government Digital Service in the UK just went live a couple weeks ago with the UK.gov's Verify service. It's, I won't say identical to what we're doing with Connect.gov, but there's a lot of similarities, including leveraging accredited private sector partners to actually be giving citizens in the UK a choice of how they get a credential to then interface with government services. And so we share a lot of lessons learned and a lot of different ideas back and forth. They're really quite similar to where we're going here.
Okay, we've got some questions that are coming in from you guys. You're tweeting at us at hashtag ThreatWatch. And first question, how feasible is it to really think that passwords are going to be extinct in the near future?
In the near future, I don't think it's feasible to think they're going to be extinct, in part because people have been saying the password's dead for a long time, and the darn thing won't die. I think Bill Gates in 2004 said the password's dead. Eric Gross, who's the VP of Security at Google, proclaimed them dead in 2013. But we're still stuck with them. I still have plenty of them, and all of us do as well. I think in the near term, what we're at least seeing is augmenting passwords with a second level of authentication so that you're at least closing off a lot of the most commonly executed security attacks. And I think that trend will continue over the next few years until new solutions start to emerge, in part supported by new technologies, new standards, if you totally replace it. So in the next 2 or 3 years, is your passwords going away? Unfortunately not, but I do think in 5 or 10 years we'll be there.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that it's just a timing thing, right? I think with the advent and the advancement of technology, this is just, it's really inevitable. We've come such a long way from a technology standpoint. When we look at mobile devices and tablets, and the opportunities that exist when it comes to this multi-factor authentication, whether it's secure applications plus biometrics equals a level of authentication, there's all sorts of different opportunities out there to eventually eliminate the password. So short term, yeah, I would agree. It's probably not on. It's probably not there. But I think we can start making those steps to pave the way so that when that time comes, we can easily kind of pass that to that next phase. So I think there's, it's really the advancement in technology that gives us the opportunity for that end game.
Another one, does using this concept mean that if a single credential is compromised, all of those users' accounts that are under that one credential are compromised?
Possibly, which is, to play up a point I said earlier, this is not about trying to push people towards a single credential. It's about trying to give them choices. Do they have a single one? Do they have multiple? And we get asked the question a lot, well, geez, if I'm consolidating all my eggs in one basket, isn't that a vulnerability? And the answer is possibly. But I also look at everything we're doing against the backdrop of what the realities of the market today. And the reality of the market today is close to half of all Americans are using the same username or password every place they go everywhere today. We know from a number of the firms that offer free email and cloud services that one of their biggest challenges is that somebody will set up an account with them, and then they'll go to, I always use the example, I go to dogcollars.com because I want to get a new studded collar for Pucci for Christmas. And they asked me to create a new account, so I'll put in my name at, say, Gmail, and then I'm asked to create a password, and I'll put in my Gmail password. And because dogcollars.com doesn't exactly have stellar security, when that site's breached, the most valuable thing that comes out of it is that list of unencrypted usernames and passwords that they can then plug into Google and the other email providers and try and use that to take over the accounts. So there's nothing about NSTIC that's trying to solve every problem that's out there in cybersecurity, and if anybody thinks there's a single silver bullet for cybersecurity, I'll have a good argument with you outside later. But we are trying to do is materially raise the bar in terms of what people are using today so that we're not tied to this just ridiculously weak, outdated mode of authentication. And I would advise anybody who's concerned about that, and I think there's reasons to be concerned about having all their eggs in one basket, you might want to have different types of credentials for different accounts. Right,
and to that point, I think that's an important one. So, for instance, in Pennsylvania, so you've got the citizen directory, but then there's also several other directories based on what Jeremy was talking about. So we've got an employee directory. And so it's an entirely different directory. We've also got a business partner directory that's also separate from that. So a user could technically have accounts in all three of those different directories, or two of the three, or one of the three. So it gives that level of choice depending on what that user is accessing. So if they're a Commonwealth employee, they could be in the citizen directory doing business as a citizen, but we want to keep that separation. So I think that's first and foremost. But on top of it, there's other technologies. I spoke about the advent and the advancement of technologies, so that if a user's credential was to be compromised, that password, there are technologies out there, especially from a device standpoint. So for instance, vetting that this user is utilizing, coming in on a certain device, on a trusted device. So it's based on patterns of behavior. And I think you'll start seeing some of these different types of authentication mechanisms based on user behavior, or what device are they coming in on. And any anomalies then would not allow access. So I think that's some of the ways then to prevent that if somebody was to steal that credential, they have the keys to the kingdom. Potentially not if those other technologies are utilized.
Okay, yeah. I've heard of an authentication method that might use doodling, the way the time that it takes you to spell your name, the angle of the letters.
Based on, user behavior and what's known. So, and obviously there's some challenges with that. So, but I think that technology is advancing so quick. And even, as I mentioned, up to the mobile device. If a user is constantly coming in on this trusted mobile device, that's a trusted device, and that device, and that account gets stolen, and they're using something else, it's just not going to work. So those are some of the controls from a behavioral standpoint, as you mentioned, and then this device technology. So I think bridging the gap and kind of utilizing either of those technologies or both will prevent something like that if a user credential was to get compromised.
Another question from the audience. This is about something that's available here now for killing the password or better protecting it. What do you think about password wallets and password managers? Are they safe? Have you ever tried one?
Short answer is there's a lot of products, and some are better than others, and I'm not going to get into product reviews in this. I think they're a good interim step. There's also been some studies showing that depending on the product, they do have some vulnerabilities that can, again, once they're unlocked, create problems. I think where they're helpful is in helping the end user create and manage stronger passwords. However, if those passwords aren't being stored securely on the back end of the site that you're actually going to, there's vulnerabilities. There's other places that they're a good interim step. It's probably better to use one on balance today than just try and manage 30 different passwords on your own. But we don't view that as the end state solution. What we view as the end state is getting towards much stronger forms of authentication.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think it's definitely a step that users can take, or if they're unsure of how to maintain all these different credentials. But obviously they've got to keep that secured, right? They've got to keep that secured with a password and make sure they're using a program that's trusted. There's a lot of different applications and programs out there that do this type of stuff, and are they vetted? So I would, so I think that's some of the questions. But it's a good first step, but it's not. It's, as Jerry mentioned, I don't think it's that end game nirvana.
How do each of you remember your passwords personally?
Well, I got a system, but if I explained it here, it would help somebody crack it. So
I think I'm the same. I do have a system that I use, and it helps me remember what the passwords are. I think, and that's the important thing. I think if people are having a hard time, or if they're not using a program like we were just talking about, to have some sort of a system that they could use, especially if they've got a number of credentials that make it hard to memorize.
I will say one thing I do is actually make a decision myself when I'm setting up an account whether I care if it's compromised or not, because a lot of them, if it doesn't matter, I actually use the same password across a lot of different sites where it's just a dumb login to buy something at a site, and the worst that's going to happen is, say, my credit card gets compromised, in which case I'm candidly, personally already absolved of liability, and that's, assuming the site doesn't have good, security on the payment systems. I tend to focus on a few sites that really matter to me in my personal life that I would not want to get compromised, and that's where I really focus on protecting myself through a password. And I use multi-factor authentication wherever I can. And that's one thing I can make a plug for. There's a lot of free applications that are out there today. I am personally using free multi-factor solutions from Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, Apple, Facebook, Yahoo, and Microsoft. That's 7 different ones today. Now, The challenge with this is we're going from 27 passwords to 27 different MFA solutions is we're just creating another usability problem. But I would recommend that people actually protect the accounts that they really care about with some of the free solutions that are out there for multi-factor today. Where we're really focused with an NSTIC is trying to come up with a framework of standards and rules. So how can I use one or two of those credentials every place I go? Right now, there's not a good framework if I want to use my Twitter two-factor solution to log into Google or vice versa. When you have better standards and operating rules that govern how those credentials are used, that's when you can allow people to have a much more ease of use with a strong technology.
And I guess that's where NIST would come in with those standards.
Well, NIST and the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group that I mentioned. We really shouldn't be writing the standards ourselves in NIST. What we're really looking to do is get the private sector convened, and we've got a steering group with more than 350 members right now that's actually working on coming up with that body of standards and policies that can enable this. And it's free to join, idecosystem.org.
Okay, we are about out of time, so thank you, Eric and Jeremy, for joining us. And now, don't go anywhere. Stay tuned for our next interview with Daniela Fair and General Dynamics IT. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much to our panel for that really interesting discussion. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in today. Hi, I'm Daniela Fair. I'm the publisher of Government Executive Media Group. And I'm here today with Hodari McLean of General Dynamics Information Technology to continue the conversation on the future of the password. First, a few words about Hodari. Mr. McLean has numerous years of systems engineering and integration experience, designing and implementing a wide array of multi-factor and strong authentication security initiatives. He and his team have successfully completed complex multi-year identity and access management systems integration projects for the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Marine Corps, and built a commercial cloud PKI offering cross-certified to the Federal Bridge. This offering served as the foundation for a corporate General Dynamics smart card strong authentication pilot. A man with some expertise. I'd like to thank General Dynamics Information Technology for supporting today's viewcast, and thanks, Hodari, for being here today.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, is the password dying, and why?
Yes, but as the other panelists touched on previously, a slow and painful death, unfortunately. There's a couple of reasons. Specifically in the government, the HSPD 12 and OMB 1111 mandates have not been fully implemented, so they haven't replaced all the username passwords that are out there. And again, the most readily available form of multi-factor is the PIV and the CAT card, which contain the X509 certificates. And there's a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is the ease of use, right? And the technical expertise required to properly implement the two-factor, multi-factor authentication systems. Users are increasingly demanding commoditized identity ecosystems that just work like any other infrastructure component. Like, you're not fiddling with your network trying to get it to work.
Right.
It just works, right? So that's kind of where we're going with this. Another reason why they haven't been implemented is because of the lack of agency funding. HSPD 12 is largely an unfunded mandate. So the password-killing technology deployments, just they're not at the forefront. They're not in the budgets, right? So until cheaper, faster, and better, and easier solutions other than password authentication come along, agencies will largely avoid that upfront investment in the expertise needed to deploy these systems. In the long term, it actually will end up saving money. If you've ever looked into the cost of a password breach. I know for commercial companies it's probably a lot more than for government, but just the hours spent and the on the investigation, right, the forensics and whatnot. And the last reason is moving from passwords to some form of multi-factor authentication. It's a major change, a behavioral change for people who have been using computers, and they've been using passwords for the last 30 years. Right? And so there's cultural issues with that of people just wanting to resist status quo and a change to the status quo. But there's also what I think are legitimate issues about the privacy of the biometric identification information. Okay. So some of the other panelists touched on the tipping point of password and the death of the password. Some people say it was 2004, some people say 2013, some people say 2014. It'll be a while probably because passwords are the default. That's the bottom line. I know recently I've just gotten a new Android phone, and that has facial biometric out of the box on it. So I've been putting that through its paces to see how it works with a PIN as a backup, of course. So it's sort of chaining those authentication methods together. I don't have lights like this in my house, but if I did, it would work a lot better. So it's still better than it was 5 years ago in terms of error rates in processing biometric identification and authentication, but I think we still have a little ways to go. So I just wanted to read a quote from the White House cyber czar, Michael Daniel. He, in an interview with the Christian Science Monitor, he recently said, "Frankly, I would really love to kill the password dead as a primary security method because it's terrible. It has to be replaced with something that's easy to use. Some may be biometric related. You could use the camera on cell phones, which are now ubiquitous, so that selfies are actually used for something besides posting on Facebook." And I largely agree with that opinion. As we become more and more reliant on web systems, whether they be databases or websites or cloud is a big initiative right now. We're moving all of our data up to the internet effectively. Securing them with authentication methods that are strong become that much more important. We see this with the recent data breaches of Target and Snapchat and, the fappening, the snapping, all of these happenings, right? So we're 80 to 100 million user identities lost is now becoming the norm. That made news. Now that doesn't even make news. Some breaches in the government, OPM recently was hacked, USIS. This is really scary for us. But it's a constant cat and mouse game of the attacker trying to stay ahead of the defender. So this is a way in which we can try to secure those sites. So these happenings are going to make the death of the password inevitable because security is suddenly everyone's problem now. It's not just the government's, right? So this is going to foster innovation from the private sector, as Jeremy stated earlier, which is really what we need because they're going to be coming up with the creative solutions. It's not all bad news. Government X509 programs or the CAC and PIV programs, a lot of that technology is now supported out of the box by the major tech vendors. So it's much less of a cobbled solution.
Okay, terrific. So how do we address some of these challenges that you just mentioned, that they mentioned on the panel? You know, what are the next steps to ensuring security today, and I guess downfield in the future?
Sure. Well, the guidance is there. HSPD 12 been out for 10 years.
Right.
OMB 1111 been out for 3 years, as well as NSTIC that the other panelists mentioned. Recently, the executive order for improving the security of consumer financial transactions just a couple of weeks ago was put out. That's with the 18-month deadline for government agencies to secure that citizen-facing data with multi-factor authentication. So there's many open source and commercial products and solutions out there that are going to help address the challenges. FIDO was mentioned earlier, which is the Fast Identity Online Alliance. They're doing some good work with that UTF and UAF standard, which is the Universal Second Factor. That's actually the standard behind the Google Security Key, which you may have seen some news on that. ForgeRock Federal Connect, that's a new program that's going to leverage the Federal Cloud Credential Exchange, which is another NSTIC initiative that they partnered up with the U.S. Postal Service to provide. So a lot of solutions are coming out of the commercial space, like Google, Apple, those sorts of things. Yeah. Again, the selfie authentication that Mr. Daniel referred to is starting to take hold. MicroStrategy Usher, which is kind of an emerging device-centric technology that leverages selfie authentication. Gmail, which I personally use, the Google Authenticator, two-step. Authy, which is another, I think it started as an Apple application, but it's cross-platform now. The financial industry is mostly developing their stuff in-house, but they're starting to look outward now. Twitter Digits is about to launch, which is another multi-factor. And fingerprint biometric is included in a lot of the new iOS platforms from Apple. So it's taking hold. I think the best products to emerge will couple a lot of the best of all of these, right? With it'll have identity proofing, strong crypto, PKI, identity management, time-based authentication. Some will be device-centric. Others will have inherited trust concepts, and interoperability is the key. So the next steps, again, promote the pilot deployments, right? We have to make mistakes to learn. Right. So wherever possible, this will provide that risk reduction of making the mistakes with, at a large scale instead of a smaller scale. And it'll help both users and developers or implementers become familiar with the technology. Continue implementing strong authentication for logical network access for civilian agencies in accordance with the FICAM guidance. What we like to do is go after high-value user communities and those high-risk roles, user roles. Protect all citizen personal data with multi-factor authentication. Again, back to that executive order. And especially be open to new alternative technologies to realize some of those initiative goals. Even if we are going to step outside, we need to ensure that those are strong, based on strong crypto, again, the alternative technologies. So even what we recognize as the strongest encryption today will be defeated easily by faster machines in the future, and even today by well-placed malware. Oh, wow.
Have you seen any agencies or organizations that have successfully been moving towards password reduction? Can you cite some of those examples for our audience today?
Sure. I basically spent the last 10 years of my career in ensuring the death of the password, working on a multitude of programs, but started out with the early CAC integration with DoD, and have had the opportunity to continue working with DoD and some of the civilian agencies. So defense and IC, the intelligence community, way out in front in terms of recognizing the inherent weakness in passwords and moving to a stronger authentication. They got it 10 to 15 years ago, and now the civilians are just catching up. So they also had a strong background in crypto, right, and in implementing technology on a large scale, which helped them a lot. Recently, efforts have been underway to take it a step further and not just securing the front door or the remote access, right, of the machine, but also the back-end systems of databases and management interfaces and whatnot. DHS got off to a slow start, but they've been doing a good job recently. DOE has come a long way in terms of reducing the password dependence, especially on Unix systems. Mixed results through the rest of the executive branch, and legislative and judicial are pretty hands-off, doesn't apply kind of thing. So card issuance is fairly well defined through those NIST publications, FIPS 201 and whatnot. The usage, however, is not. So HSPD 12, again, 10 years in. I don't know what the numbers are, but we're not at 100%, right? Yeah. But we've been doing a lot of good work over the last few years. NSTIC, OMB 1111, 3+ years. White House defined HSPD 12 as a cross-agency priority, or CAP, in fiscal year 2012. So the momentum is starting to kick in, right? A lot of agencies are still moving slowly in terms of eliminating passwords, but the move to multi-factor is happening.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. What are some examples of the technology being used as opposed to passwords? So what is being done, in that regard?
Sure. Technology-wise, again, CAC and PIV cards, right? Okay. Other public key infrastructures, security key, Authy, some of those solutions that I mentioned earlier. Other hardware tokens, RSA, you see those a lot. Yeah. Software certificates, which is like still based on crypto, but it's not a second factor of something you have, of a card, right? It's on the machine. Knowledge-based authentication, or KBA, right? One-time password via SMS, IVR, or voice biometric. Trust-based transactions, and kind of measuring the authenticity of attribute claims, which is somewhat new. Okay. A little small company called Araxid is working on that. And device-based and derived credentials. Some kind of far out or science fiction technology, biometric, vascular biometrics, right? Which would be like a wristband or one of those new smartwatches, where if you moved it away from your pulse, it automatically break the authentication stream and make you have to re-authenticate. Chemical passwords and combinatorial molecular keypads, which that's way out there, right? The Weizmann Institute is working on that right now. Behavioral biometric, which was mentioned earlier, which would be keystroke or mouse or any other behavior attributes that you might, Authenware is working on that right now. And quantum authentication protocols, which is states of matter, basically, and that's research lab, still in the formative stages. But yeah, those are some of the technologies. And NIST has done a good job of promoting these identity ecosystems with their that NSTIC program. And ID.me was mentioned earlier, that Troop ID, which is a solution for military families. And then also the Morpho Trust, which leverages existing state credentials. They've recently received an NSTIC grant. NIST has also recently issued guidance on derived credentials for CAC and PIV, using smartphones and other devices that work at authentications level 3 and 4. MicroStrategy's Usher solution provides 3-factor authentication with a unique marriage of PIN, biometric, and PKI to turn mobile devices into derived credentials for a variety of use cases.
Interesting. Fascinating what's going on. Well, we're running out of time, so finally I'd just like to ask, where does General Dynamics information technology come in, and what do you all provide that can help agencies move forward?
Yeah, so General Dynamics IT is a FIPS 201 HSPD 12 certified solution provider. So we provide system infrastructure, engineering, integration services, COT software for enrollment, registration, activation, and finalization, card management systems, card personalization. GDIT has partnered with a number of vendors, including HID Global, or the people behind Active Identity, ForgeRock, Gemalto, F5, Ping Identity, and others. We specialize in LAX integration, which is the logical access, for public key enablement, which will help you get rid of passwords effectively, including network logon, user and privileged, email encryption and digital signature, cloud integration as well. So we performed a variety of multi-factor authentication deployments, both COTS and custom, for DHS, DOD, intelligence community, Department of Labor. So we're out there. And we've also done some state governments, and we're involved with the FRAC program for Maryland, Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Hawaii. So we can assist agencies in safeguarding data with multi-factor authentication and helping with the mandate compliance. And finally, putting the nail in the coffin of password.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Hadari. We appreciate your insights and your participation today. Thanks again to our viewers for tuning in. I did want to note that this viewcast will remain online for the next 3 months if you'd like to view it again or share it with your colleagues. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you next time.